My name is Claire. I'm 36 and I've built a life filled with secrets. By day, I'm a nurse in a bustling hospital, tending to wounds, administering care, and offering the kind of compassion that I rarely extend to myself. By night, under dim lights and heavy basslines, I shed my scrubs for sequins and my practicality for allure. I dance at a club downtown, a world as far removed from the hospital as I can imagine. Nobody knows about the club, not my colleagues, my friends, or my family. It's my escape, my guilty reprieve from the monotony of my life. Sometimes I think I ended up there because I was lonely. There's an emptiness in my world that I can't fill, a craving for attention that I've tried to drown out but never quite managed to silence. The club, for all its chaos, provides me with a fleeting sense of being seen. I'd gotten good at keeping the two halves of my life separate until my nephew Caleb showed up unexpectedly one Saturday evening. He was 18 now, no longer the little boy who used to cling to my leg, begging me to read him one more story. My sister, his mother, had always been busy with work, leaving him with me more often than not. I didn't mind. In fact, I loved it. We had a bond that felt unshakable, built on years of shared laughs and adventures. But a year ago he moved to another city for his training. He's a CrossFit enthusiast with dreams of becoming a coach. Our phone calls had dwindled, texts becoming sporadic as his life filled with competitions and practice sessions. I wasn't expecting to hear from him, let alone see him, so when he knocked on my door that night, I was stunned. "Caleb?" I asked, opening the door to find him standing there with his signature grin, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. "Surprise," he said, pulling me into a hug. His arms were strong, his grip firm, a reminder of how much he'd grown. I had a free weekend and thought I'd come see my favorite aunt. My heart swelled at his words. "Get in here," I said, laughing as I stepped aside. "You should have told me you were coming. I'd have cleaned up." The truth was, I'd been lounging in sweats, my hair tied in a messy bun. The remnants of a TV dinner sat on the coffee table. It wasn't exactly the kind of welcome I wanted to give him, but Caleb didn't seem to mind. The evening unfolded easily, like no time had passed. We talked about his training, his plans for coaching, and how much he missed home. I told him about my work at the hospital, carefully omitting the part about my nights at the club. "You're still working those long shifts?" he asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "Yeah," I admitted. "It keeps me busy." "You need to take care of yourself, Aunt Claire," he said, his tone teasing but earnest. "I can't have you burning out." I laughed, brushing off his concern. "I'm fine. Really." But as the night wore on, I felt a strange shift between us. It wasn't something I could name, but it was there. A new tension that hadn't existed before. Caleb wasn't a little boy anymore. He was confident, mature in a way that caught me off guard. And I was acutely aware of how much he had changed. The next morning I woke to the smell of coffee. Caleb had taken it upon himself to brew a pot, the scent wafting through the apartment like a small act of care. "Morning," he said, grinning as I shuffled into the kitchen. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up." "Thanks," I said, taking the mug he offered. "You didn't have to do this." He shrugged, leaning against the counter. "You've done enough for me over the years. It's the least I can do." We spent the day together, running errands and catching up. He even convinced me to join him at the gym, where he insisted on coaching me through a light workout. I felt ridiculous, struggling through exercises he performed effortlessly, but his encouragement kept me going. "You've still got it," he said as I finished a set of squats, his grin wide and genuine. "You're tougher than you think." By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I'd planned to head to the club that night, but with Caleb around, I couldn't risk it. Instead, we ordered takeout and settled in to watch a movie. As the credits rolled, Caleb turned to me, his expression serious. "I've missed this," he said. "Just hanging out with you." "I've missed it too," I admitted, feeling a pang of guilt for letting the distance grow between us. He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You've always been there for me, Aunt Claire. More than anyone else." I smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Of course I have. Your family." His eyes held mine for a moment too long, and I felt my heart skip. There was something in his gaze, something unspoken but undeniable. I quickly looked away, breaking the spell. "I should get some sleep," I said, standing abruptly. It's been a long day. Yeah, he said, his voice softer. Good night, Aunt Claire. As I lay in bed that night, my thoughts raced. The lines between us had always been clear, but now they felt blurred, like a photo just out of focus. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, and I didn't know how to handle it. Caleb stayed for the weekend, and while our interactions remained light and casual on the surface, that unspoken tension lingered. When he left on Sunday afternoon, hugging me tightly before heading out the door, I felt both relief and an ache I couldn't name. As the door clicked shut behind him, I realized that his visit had awakened something in me, something I wasn't ready to face. An hour after Caleb left, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at it, expecting a message from a coworker or a reminder for my next shift. Instead, his name appeared on the screen. Don't tell Mom I was here. I'll come visit you again next weekend if you don't mind. I stared at the words for a long moment, my heart tugging in two directions. The secrecy shouldn't have surprised me. Caleb and my sister had always had a tense relationship, each too stubborn to bridge the gap between them. Still, the message felt oddly personal, like we were sharing a secret of our own. Of course, I replied, trying to keep my response casual. Just let me know when. But as I set the phone down, an unease settled over me. Caleb wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man now, strong, confident, and far more self-assured than I'd realized. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke, even the intensity in his eyes, it all lingered with me long after he'd left. For years I had been the one taking care of him, but now for the first time I felt the balance shifting. It was unsettling, and I couldn't stop myself from wondering where this road might lead. And then there was the club. I didn't know what I'd do if Caleb ever found out about it. The thought of him walking into that dim, smoky space, seeing me in that world, made my stomach churn. I shook the thought away and went to bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The following Friday, Caleb texted me again. On my way. Hope it's okay, I'm coming late. It had been a long day at the hospital, followed by an even longer night at the club. My shift ended just after midnight, and by the time I made it home, my feet ached in their heels, my bright red dress clinging to my skin, a sheen of sweat still lingering from the stage lights. I was too exhausted to change before collapsing on the couch, my head spinning with memories of the night. I barely had time to catch my breath when there was a knock at the door. My heart leaped. I glanced at the clock, almost 1 a.m. I opened the door, still half dazed, and froze. He stood there, holding a bouquet of flowers, dressed in dark jeans and a crisp shirt that hugged his broad shoulders. His hair was neatly combed, and the scent of his cologne hit me in a wave, warm, musky, intoxicating. Sorry for the late hour, he said, his voice warm and steady. My car broke down on the way, but I didn't want to miss seeing you. I couldn't help but smile, touched by his effort. You didn't have to go through all that trouble, Caleb. I wanted to, he replied simply, his eyes scanning me with a curious intensity. Wow, Aunt Claire, you look amazing. It took me a moment to realize he was staring at my dress. Heat crept up my neck and I stepped back to let him in, feeling suddenly self-conscious. You caught me at a bad time, I said, laughing nervously. I just got home. From work, he asked, raising an eyebrow. Because that doesn't look like a hospital uniform. His tone was teasing, but his gaze was steady, searching. I hesitated, my mind racing for an excuse, but his confident demeanor threw me off balance. He wasn't the shy boy I used to know. He was standing before me like a man who wouldn't accept half-truths. I had a work event, I said vaguely, brushing past him to grab a bottle of wine from the kitchen. You know how hospitals are. Always fundraising or hosting something. He didn't press further, but his eyes lingered on me as I poured us both a glass of wine. I could feel his gaze tracing the line of my dress, the curve of my legs still perched in heels. It wasn't just the dress, though. It was the way he looked at me, like I was someone he hadn't quite figured out yet. We sat on the couch, the tension between us subtle but unmistakable. He sipped his wine, his posture relaxed, but there was something in his expression that kept me on edge. So, he said, his voice low and smooth, do you always dress this nicely for work events, or were you planning to meet someone afterward? The question caught me off guard and I nearly spilled my wine. What? No, I said quickly, laughing to cover my nerves. It's just part of the event. You know, presentation matters. You should dress like this more often, he said, his tone softening. You're beautiful, Aunt Claire. Honestly, you look younger than half the women my age. I blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. That's sweet of you to say, Caleb, but you don't have to flatter me. It's not flattery, he insisted, leaning closer. It's the truth. The warmth in his voice made my chest tighten, and I found myself averting my gaze, unsure of how to respond. Caleb had always been kind, but this felt different. More deliberate, more intentional. He shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. You work so hard, Claire, he said softly. You deserve to be noticed. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in the air between us. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had said something like that to me. Not with that kind of sincerity, not with that kind of intensity. You're too kind, I said, forcing a smile as I took a long sip of my wine, hoping to drown out the way my pulse was racing. We talked late into the night, but the dynamic between us had shifted. Caleb's confidence, his maturity, the way he looked at me, it all stirred something in me that I couldn't ignore. To my surprise, Caleb didn't leave that night. After we finished our wine and settled into the soft hum of late-night conversation, he stretched out on the couch, looking entirely at home. It's too late to drive back now, he said, his voice casual but warm. I'll crash here if that's okay. Of course, I said, trying to ignore the flutter in my chest. You're always welcome here. The clock read past 2 in the morning when I stood, stretching. You must be hungry. Let me make you something. But Caleb shook his head, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. I've got a better idea. Get dressed. I'm taking you somewhere. I blinked, caught off guard. At this hour? Caleb, where could you possibly? Trust me, Aunt Claire, he interrupted, standing and grabbing his keys. You like it? Curiosity won out over fatigue. I quickly changed into a more comfortable outfit, jeans and a sweater, then followed him to his car. The city was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Caleb drove with an easy confidence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift. Music played softly from the radio, a mellow tune that filled the silence between us. Where are we going? I asked, stealing a glance at him. He looked so sure of himself, his profile illuminated by the dashboard lights. Strong jawline, sharp features, and the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. You'll see, he said, his tone playful. It's a surprise. We drove for a while, leaving the heart of the city behind. The streets grew quieter and the buildings gave way to open spaces. Eventually, he pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. The place had an old-school charm with large open windows, neon signs, and music spilling out into the cool night air. This is it? I asked, stepping out of the car. This is the first stop, he said with a grin. They have the best late-night food. You'll love it. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and freshly cooked meals. We ordered burgers and milkshakes, the kind of indulgent food that tasted even better when you weren't supposed to be eating it at 2 in the morning. Caleb paid without hesitation, waving off my protests, and we decided to take our food to go. Back in the car, I watched him as he navigated the winding roads with ease. His confidence was magnetic and I couldn't help but feel drawn to him. I caught myself staring more than once, studying the way his hands gripped the wheel, the way his lips curved when he smiled. You're awfully quiet, he said, glancing at me with a knowing look. Everything okay? Yeah, I said quickly, tearing my gaze away. Just wondering what this next surprise is. You'll see, he said again, his voice teasing. We drove up a hill that overlooked the city, the road dark and secluded. When we reached the top, he parked the car and turned to me with a smile. Come on. This is the best part. I stepped out of the car and immediately felt the cool night breeze. Caleb grabbed the bag of food and we walked a short distance to a clearing where the entire city stretched out before us. The view was breathtaking, twinkling lights blanketing the landscape, 1,000 stories unfolding in the quiet glow of the night. Wow, I whispered, taking it all in. This is beautiful. I thought you'd like it, he said, setting the food down on a nearby bench. He stood beside me, his arm brushing mine, and for a moment we both just stared out at the view. The silence between us felt heavy but comforting, like there was nothing more to say. I turned to look at him, and that's when I realized I wasn't just admiring the view. I was admiring him. The way the moonlight softened his features, the way he stood with quiet confidence. I liked him, not just as my nephew, not just as the boy I'd helped raise, but as the man he had become. As if sensing my thoughts, Caleb turned to me. His expression was soft, his eyes searching mine. Without a word, he wrapped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me into a gentle hug. "I've missed you," he murmured, his voice low and full of emotion. "I've missed you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his hand lingering on my arm. There was a pause, a moment suspended in time before he leaned in and kissed me. It was soft, hesitant at first, as if he were testing the waters. But when I didn't pull away, it deepened, and I felt a warmth spread through me that I hadn't felt in years. When he pulled back, his gaze held mine, unspoken emotions swirling in his eyes. "I don't want to scare you, Claire," he said softly. "But I've thought about this moment for so long. I've thought about you." My breath caught, the weight of his words settling over me. "Caleb, I know it's complicated," he continued, his voice steady. "But I need you to know how I feel." I looked away, my heart racing. The city lights stretched out before us, indifferent to the turmoil in my chest. When I finally looked back at him, I saw not just the man he'd become but the boy who had always been there, who had always cared for me in his own quiet way. "I don't know where this will lead," I said honestly. "But I've missed you too." His smile was soft, relieved. That's all I needed to hear. We sat together in the quiet, eating our food and watching the city lights flicker like stars. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I couldn't explain. Something warm, something new, and something undeniably real. The city lights stretched endlessly below us, twinkling like stars in the cool night air. Despite the beauty of the view, I couldn't stop noticing the chill creeping over my skin. Caleb must have noticed too, because he suddenly stood, walked to the car, and returned with a blanket. Without a word, he draped it over my shoulders and then sat back down beside me, pulling it around both of us. "Better?" he asked softly, his arm brushing mine. "Much," I replied, my voice just above a whisper. Sitting there, wrapped in the warmth of the blanket and his presence, I felt a shift in myself that I hadn't expected. The pull I had always felt toward the club, the desire to be seen, to feel wanted, had vanished. Caleb filled that space effortlessly. He didn't know it, but just by being there, by caring for me in this quiet, steadfast way, he gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing: connection. As I looked at him, the realization struck me like a jolt. The club had always been my escape, a place where I could reclaim a piece of myself I thought I'd lost. But now with Caleb, I didn't need that world. He saw me. He truly saw me, and I felt a longing to show him a part of myself that I'd kept hidden for so long. Before I could overthink it, I stood, the blanket slipping from my shoulders. "Sit down," I said, a playful edge in my voice. Caleb raised an eyebrow but obeyed, settling onto the bench with an intrigued look. "What are you doing?" "You'll see," I said, my heart pounding as I stepped into the open space in front of him. The soft glow of the city lights and the moonlight gave the moment an almost dreamlike quality. I began to move, my body falling into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. The sway of my hips, the slow roll of my shoulders, it all came back so naturally, like muscle memory awakening after years of dormancy. I didn't need music. The night provided its own melody, the breeze whispering through the trees, the distant hum of the city below. Caleb's eyes widened, his posture stiffening as he watched. I saw the way his gaze followed every movement, the way his Adam's apple bobbed when he swallowed hard. His face turned red, his expression a mix of amazement and something deeper, something that sent a thrill through me. When I finished, I stepped closer, leaning down to kiss his cheek. My lips lingered there for a moment before I pulled back, my heart racing. Caleb blinked, clearly trying to process what had just happened. "Claire, how do you know how to dance like that?" His voice was thick, heavy with unspoken emotions, and his cheeks were still flushed. He looked like he'd just run a marathon. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to tell him the truth, or at least part of it. I used to dance in a strip club, I admitted, my voice steady. A long time ago. Caleb's eyes widened slightly, his surprise evident, but he didn't say anything right away. He just stared at me, his gaze searching my face as if trying to reconcile this revelation with the woman he thought he knew. You, he finally said, his voice soft. I wouldn't have guessed that in a million years. It's not something I talk about, I said, sitting back down beside him. But it was a part of my life for a while. It filled a void, I guess. Made me feel seen. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he turned to me, his eyes earnest. You don't need that, Claire. Not anymore. Something about the way he said it, the certainty in his voice, made my chest tighten. Why do you say that? Because I see you, he said simply. I've always seen you. The weight of his words settled over me, warm and grounding. I realized then that he was right. The club had been a crutch, a way to mask the loneliness I didn't know how to face. But with Caleb I didn't feel lonely. I felt understood. You're full of surprises, I said, smiling to lighten the mood. Coming out here, taking me to that diner, and now saying things like that. He laughed softly, the tension between us easing. I guess we're both full of surprises. We sat there for a while longer, the blanket still wrapped around us, talking about everything and nothing. The weight of my confession lingered, but it didn't feel like a burden. If anything, it felt like freedom, like I had finally let go of something I didn't need anymore. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Caleb turned to me with a soft smile. Can I take you out again? Maybe somewhere less cold next time? I laughed, the sound light and genuine. I'd like that.